What you're about to receive is just a few short of points taken from the campaign to abolish the slave trade, often referred to as the Wilberforce campaign, even though William Wilberforce ultimately was not the leader of the effort, but became a key person in Parliament. And there's been a lot of interest since 2007, the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. It happened, as most Canadians know, 4 years earlier in Canada. I don't know why we couldn't swing the rest of the empire with us. But there are some things that have evidenced themselves in other campaigns that have taken place in the pursuit of rights or in the pursuit of political objectives that started with the campaign to abolish the slave trade. And the campaign to abolish the slave trade broke new ground in establishing these things. So in case you don't write quickly enough to follow along with us, again, these PowerPoint slides will be available on the website at the University of Calgary that Mishka uses, and you'll be able to download them. But you may want to scribble down a few thoughts. Lauren, I learned earlier that you're really good, because I forgot to tell you to go to the next slide. I'm so accustomed to either tapping on my own computer, because that's where I'm speaking from, my notes are on my computer, or having a remote in my hand that I can just click. Because if I look at the screen, you know, you get the back of my head. It may be more attractive at times than the front, but that's life. So the past and the present, we'll go to the next slide. I've mentioned the methods that were used, and they were perfected during what is often referred to as the campaign to abolish slavery. The abolition of slavery was the ultimate objective, but they settled on the objective of abolishing the slave trade because they realized the interim objective would, in short order, accomplish the greater objective as well. What didn't work and still doesn't work today? Next slide, please. Well, communicating in a manner that is not of the people or of Parliament doesn't work. The Quakers had grasped the significance of the evil being done through the slave trade very early on, and for 30 years they tried to bring it to an end. But they dressed in a form of clothing that made them look weird. And even though blue jeans have become more popular in our world today, it still surprises me when people go on the Hill in jeans, because that's what they wear every day, or they don't put on a tie, they don't dress for the parliamentarians in a method that says, I respect you. And we have a very, a group of young people that's become fairly influential in a number of areas on the Hill. And one of the requirements they have for these teenagers and 20-somethings that are going to the Hill is that they dress appropriately for the people they're about to meet with, and they learn that very on. The other problem the Quakers had was their language. They spoke in these and thous, not in yous. They refused to say my lord to anyone, and so they couldn't get an address with the king or with senior cabinet ministers or with the prime minister. They would not call someone Mr., so most parliamentarians would not speak with them because Mr. was a derivative of the word master. And I've mentioned earlier today the significance of using the right language to communicate with evangelicals. Well, it cuts several ways, because I can use words you won't understand, or I can use words that mean something different to you, and really the importance of using the language that reaches the people you're trying to reach. The other thing they would not say was your humble and obedient servant, which meant that it was impossible to see anyone in a position of authority, because you had to send a letter in those days addressed to whoever you wanted to speak to, requesting a meeting, and the appropriate form of closing the letter was not yours truly. It was your humble and obedient servant. Without using that language, they offended the people that they asked to meet with them. The other problem, of course, was in arranging a meeting, the Quakers of that day refused to use the days of the week or the days of the months, because they saw them all as being derived from Roman mythology and therefore not part of Christianity. It's really hard to get an appointment with someone If you're not prepared to confirm the date. And it may seem funny to us now, but you'd be surprised at how many busy people think that when they show up in Ottawa, they should be able to speak to whoever they want to, because after all, they're all sitting in their offices waiting. Some of the busiest men and women I have ever met in my entire life are members of Parliament. These are people who start their day with a breakfast meeting with somebody, then they're off to sit on a committee or into a caucus. They have a lunch meeting with somebody. If they have a lunch meeting because they don't have back-to-back committee meetings with no break for lunch, then they're in question period. Then they have a dinner meeting. Then they have an evening caucus, or they have an evening session in the House. And even though it looks to a lot of people like they only work about 5.5 months out of the year, they then get to Friday when everyone goes, oh yeah, it's nice to quit at 1 o'clock on Friday. Well, they don't quit at 1 o'clock on Friday, because then they're either going to other meetings, or they're going to other sessions, or they're going home to their riding, which when you get to your riding, you have the privilege of having 3 or 4 breakfasts every day because of breakfast meetings, 2 or 3 lunches every day, and several dinners, as well as officiating it. And these are men and women who really give up their lives to serve us. And there's a lot owed to them, no matter what the news bites might cause us to think of who they actually are. So we have to be respectful in our engagement. Next, please. So what did work? Well, they organized. Organizing is useful. They organized into, well, I'll talk about organization a bit more in a few minutes as the run begins. Not only did they organize, but they identified the issue they were focusing on. And when things started to come together, it was because they were focusing on the issue. The issue became more important than who they were. And they knew the difference between their immediate objectives and their ultimate objectives. So that when Wilberforce first introduced legislation dealing with the slave trade into the British House of Commons, the introduction was that they consider the slave trade. That's all. Let's start thinking about it. Let's start discussing it. And then the next step was, we've considered the slave trade. It's problematic. Let's abolish the slave trade. And then, of course, the fortuitousness of England and France having a disagreement. Who would have thought that would happen? When the war started, now the opportunity that presented itself was dealing with ships that were not flying British flags and not flying American flags. They didn't want to get into a thing with the US. They had other things going on there. And so they found a way to deal with the slave trade without abolishing it that would abolish the slave trade, that led ultimately to the abolition of the slave trade legislation passing in the House, recognizing that their ultimate objective to abolish slavery would be accomplished once there was no more slave trade. It was only a matter of time after that. So this was not actually ever constituted as a movement to abolish slavery, because they stepped back and they said, our goal will be to abolish the slave trade. The ultimate goal will take place in time.